If everyone can put on mute, would be good.
Yeah.
Okay, Hemshech Ayin Beis, learning in Hemshech Ayin Beis, when the pages we're middle of is 1147 through 1149, and in Tzadik Daled, we're on page 57. 57, top of page 57, which is what we're going to be learning now. So again, summing up, using the example from us, from a human being below, we're learning to understand the process through which God used, the process God used to create. Obviously, there are qualifications that distinguish, but since we are created in the divine image and God created us and the logic and the structure of existence, how things are built and things are created mirroring his own process, and his own process is necessary for us to be able to relate to the divine, which is the essence of the whole interface. So we're talking about, and just to sum up the whole picture, we're talking about Yesh and Yesh. So the ultimate source, Atzmus, Yesh Hamiti, it's called, the absolute and absolute and true reality. Mitziusim Atzmuse, built to Mitzius Nimtza, Mechuyev HaMitzius, all the expressions to describe the way Atzmus, as much as we can describe Atzmus. And then Yesh HaNivra, which is the created Yesh, that has a similarity with Atzmus because it also senses Yesh Ma'ayin Ve'efes HaMuchas. It does not relate to a source, has its own self-contained reality. And then there's the Ayin Be'emtza, the Oyer, that's the carrier, basically the channel that goes in both directions, meaning from top down and back up, that connects the two. And that channel called Ayin breaks into two. Ayin Hamiti, that relates to the reflected energy, a divine energy that reflects the Yesh Hamiti, and the air that begins to relate to the creation and existence. In this discussion, to explain the gradations in the air, went into the discussion of Ratzon, because the Ratzon emerges in that air. So Ratzon is essentially, which is the interface between the one who desires with the thing that's being desired. So you can't say Atzmus has a Ratzon. The Ratzon emerges in the air. And we've learned basically there are two levels of desire. One is the determination. The second is the pursuit. And that's what he's going to say soon here, but in Ayin Beis we already learned is like the two levels of Ayin. Because one reflects the Ratzon of the one who desires, and one is already pursuing and relating to existence. But let's not jump the gun. That was in Ayin Beis because we already learned Ayin Beis, remember, further than Tzadik Daled. Now we're catching up because Tzadik Daled is elaborating on these two levels of desire. The additional point he made was to make it clear that even desire, even Ratzon, which is a makif, has in it levels. That's critical because the levels is going to be the definition of the structure of existence. And we're saying the levels don't begin with the structure, they already begin in the desire for the structure. Keep that in mind. Very vital point I just made. And what's the reason for that is because the pnimi, because the makif travels through the pnimi. Like you said, the igulim go through the kav. But here's an important qualification. Before the tzimtzum, there is no kav. And there is no pnimi as we're going to learn in a moment, explicitly. So you have to say, and this is how I explained it, you have to say it's because the desire is for existence. He's desiring pnimi, so to speak. So in a way, that forms in some envision way in the Ratzon details with the example that he's giving of the person who wants to build a home. So he said, first stage is a Ratzon Klali to have a home And there are no details. He mentioned three types of details, not the chaymer, not the materials for the house, stones, wood, and offer, earth. Not the tzir of the shape of the rooms. And not the third thing was, what was the third thing in the mashal? And for sure, not the kalim, the furniture that goes into each room according to each thing in its particular place. So this is a mashal straight from the Maimer. The Maimer is from the Ayin Beis, actually. So this mashal is a very good mashal that I've been using also the mashal of art and the artist. It's essentially the same thing, because it's all about creating something that has shape and form and structure, and looking at the one who's creating it and the stages the creator goes through till he gets to the point where he's relating to the details, and how the details are informed by the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is shaped by the details, as we spoke. So this mashal tells us that there's two stages. One is a general desire, like he says, the lashon is Aratzon klali, b'klolisin habayis, and there you cannot distinguish any details, and then it comes into the details. Yeah. But both of them are already after there was a inspiration for it all. And he says, and this is a dogma for above, the same thing. Sevav Kalalman is removed from, but already is starting to have a relationship with the Pnimi. And there's two stages. Makiv Klali, like a Rotzen Klali. It encompasses the whole thing, but it's not in details. And then the details begin to emerge, even in the Sevav. Levels begin to emerge. But again, it's on the level of Ratzon, not on the level of action. So, okay, but before we go on to the next piece, which he starts going now backwards, what happened? What's going on before this desire emerged? Even the general desire. So before we go there, I just wanted to make one more point that we learned yesterday, was that what was the point? Yeah. That he explained in Aveda the idea of Makif and Pnimi. That Pnimi is the 10 Keiches HaNefesh, the 10 faculties. And Makif is what he called was Ru'usa Deliba, Nekudas Hayadus, and Keich HaMesiris Nefesh. The desire of the heart. Basically, these are transcendent faculties within us that have an intrinsic and inherent connection to the divine. So one is a desire of the heart. The Nekudas Hayad is the spark, or the pintle, the dot of the essential point of Jewishness, of Yadus, the pintle Yid, and the Keich HaMesiris Nefesh, the power of Mesiris Nefesh. And he associated that with Ein Sof Shalamayla Matzilus, Ein Sof Shalamayla Matzilus. So that he just added that element. I just wanted to review that for a moment. Okay. Now let's go back here. So the two desires, levels of desire, two levels. But he said, Omnam be'etzem, however, if you really go back to the source, moving backwards to the source, the makif, what he calls here, Omnam, he says these words. You do makif kamoshu be'etzem. In other words, the way it originates in its source, it's completely removed. It has no shaykhs at all to existence. So this in the mashal would be before we even have a desire to have a home, even the general desire. So now we're talking about an estate with the etzem hanefesh in the person. And here he's talking about the etzem ha'er in Lamaila, doesn't yet have a relationship at all. Nothing was stimulated. There was no inspiration. Why is it then called makif? So he said, because it's completely removed. But from there will originate the desire, the general desire, and then the specific desire. So now we've moved backwards. Now, so in a way, basically the discussion of Ratzon is now coming to an end. We're going to go back to it, but he's going back to the levels higher than Ratzon. When I mean Ratzon, I mean the two Ratzon that are in a state of after inspiration. We're not talking about the Ratzon HaMuchlad Ba'atzmusei that is embedded and wired in the Etzem before there's any awareness of it. Here there is awareness. The difference is it's a determination, or it's a pursuit, an active pursuit, or it's a general desire and its details. They seem to be very connected, those two. Okay. So now he's saying it has no shaykhus at all. And makif means here completely removed. We spoke yesterday, why is it called makif? So he does say, gam hu boli is bebekinis makif. And now, what is this in Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum? So now I'm going to read this again, so we'll have the flow. There's the bottom of page 56, and we're going to move to the top of 57. He says, Asher keinu gam be'erein sof shelifnei tzimtzum. So too is it in the Erein Sof, in the divine infinite energy or field of energy before the tzimtzum. The atzmus Erein Sof baruch hu eina begeder shachas el elmas kla. You can't even say a rotzen for elemus. There's no desire. The whole thing it's reflecting atzmus. Yes, it's true that atzmus has nesava and for dira b'tachtenim, but it's not taken on the shape of a rotzen yet. It's all about atzmus. Everything is atzmusdik. The only thing you can say is that it's moved from Bebilta Mitzias Nimtza, which is completely a different reality, to the world of Mitzias Nimtza, to existential reality. But you cannot say that it's moved to a point where it relates to anything. It doesn't relate to anything. All it is atzmus desire for something. Remember what I said yesterday in the previous classes. That purity is vital because if you want a relationship with the Eibishter, with God, you want it in the purest way, undiluted, even by the word relationship. So relationship already indicates some form of connection. Here, we're talking about levels that are just reflecting atzmus without getting into any aspect of what is desired. Therefore, you don't
atzmus or oil.
That's why you don't define. There's no rotzen yet. So you call
talking
it
about oil in soft or the atzmus.
Let me just finish what I'm saying, and then you'll speak. I'm middle of a sentence. So therefore, it is now we're talking about, as it says these words. So it's completely on atzmus terms. Yeah, what would you like to say?
I want to know, is this talking about atzmus, or about oil in sof?
Why don't you read the line, read it out loud to all of us.
Atzmus oil in sof baruch hu.
There you go. So atzmus ein sof. It doesn't say atzmus. Atzmus ein sof is not atzmus muhus mitzusim atzmusei. It's atzmus ha'er. Yeah. V'yesh madreges gam be'erein sof. And now he's saying there are levels also in this erein sof. There are levels. If you remember, we learned in the beginning of this whole point that oir is subject to levels. Atzmi is not. Oir is. So there are levels lifnei tzimtzum. Shem b'chinas shaychus ala elemus. Levels that develop a relationship. Again, a relationship doesn't mean there are two entities. There are no two entities till after the tzimtzum. But in the entity called Eir, there's already envisioning another, relating to another. Like I said before a number of times, for the artist to create art, first he has to attach himself and say, I want to create art. The wanting art is a relationship with the art, even though there's no art yet. The wanting a home is a relationship with a home, even though there's no home yet. So there's a state where you don't even have that. That's atzmus ein sof, where you don't even have that step. And then there's a step in ein sof where you begin to having that rotzen, and that itself breaks into two levels, a general desire and a specifics and details. So what you have is a logical progression from a state of atzmi to a state of complete structure. So it's beginning to emerge how you get from the highest to from the producer to the product. Now he's going to explain what does it mean in Ein Sof that you have a relationship. So he says that's what means aliyas harotzen. There's an expression kisha'olah b'rtzenei u'kamaymer. When it arose in his shapeless desire, lahaitzil, to emanate. So it's an expression olah b'rtzenei. So if it wasn't physical time, it would be there was a moment before you desired, then it arose in your desire. Obviously, here there's no time, so you say it as levels, as conceptual levels that exist right now as well. That there's a state, what we call koydem alei saratzen. He doesn't use that word here, but in other places that's used. And kisha'olah b'rtzenei. Where was it Allah? Where did it rise? It didn't arise after the tzimtzum because there would be no tzimtzum if there was no Allah b'rtzenei. It arose in Ein Sof itself, in this field of energy. Now, God is essentially instructing Eir to turn into a shape, a beginning of I can't call it real shape, it's shapeless, but a beginning of associating with, conceptually, with Elamus. So you see, there's a Aliyas HaRatzon in Ein Sof. So you have Atzmus, Ein Sof, and now Ratzon emerging from it. The Yesham, and then there's another level. The Yesham Hashara al Elamus. Not only is there a desire for them, there's Hashara on the Elamus. Hashara, as I've defined, could be envisioning, allocating, estimate, envisioning, allocating. What was the third expression I used? Hashara. Bottom line, yes. It's getting into the state of relating more than just a rotzen. You could say here that the rotzen hashara maybe is the two levels of rotzen. Some places in Chassidus says there's 4 levels, but I don't want to go into that right now. This comes from Migdash Melech, a commentary on Zoyar, on the Zoyar that we said Bereish Ramanusa de Malka, Goliv Golifu B'Tihiri Law. So Bereish Ramanusa, her Manisa has 2 meanings, Rishus and Rotzen. That's how it's interpreted. So in the beginning, when the Malka was her Manisa, Bereish Ramanusa, the beginning of his desire, Rotzen, or the Rishus of the king, which is connected. What happened? Goliv Golifu B'Tihiri Law. That something was inscribed in Tihiri Law. That is defined as being the Shir Atzmei B'Kayach. That is beginning
estimate. No, Shir, estimate.
I used estimate all the time, but it's not exactly, because estimate would be like approximate. That's why, but yes, Shir is correct. Shir Atzmei B'Kayach is like think of it like a craftsman who prepares. He asks you need someone to come fix your electricity in your house. She says, what's the problem? And you tell him, and he says, okay, now he estimates essentially what he's going to need, what resources he will need. So in that sense, yes, it's just not estimate as in a guess, but shir is to be meshayir means to imagine almost, but not imagine in a dream-like way. It's like to envision, to prepare, to allocate, to estimate. These are all correct words. So it's all within himself, meaning it's not implemented yet. He's beginning the process of, essentially, it's like the artist setting aside and preparing all the necessary resources to then create the art. So, in other words, Atzmus is not working on a kol yochel level that he can do whatever he wants, which he can. He doesn't need resources. He says, let there be existence. There's existence. But he wants it to be in a way that we should have a model that we can emulate and relate to. So anyone who's building something needs to prepare. What am I going to need to make this world? That's basically what it really means. He's preparing the ground of all the tools necessary. Now, obviously, this is all within Ein Sof, but it's levels. So we have Ein Sof, it's Atzmus Ein Sof. We have the Rotzen, Olah B'Rtzenei, and now we have the Shir Atzmei B'Kayach. These are all levels that you can use the example of building the home, and you see the levels emerge. So Hare, he continues, top of page 57. What's happening here? You just told me Ein Sof, Atzmus Ein Sof has no relationship with the world. And before the Tzimtzum in general, that's the case. So he's saying what's going on here is Gam, even that level that has no relationship at all with existence, which is what? The Hainu B'chinas HaPnimi has no relationship to Pnimi. There is no Pnimi yet. Pnimi is an internalized energy. Internalized where? Internalized in the structure of existence. So he says, even though there's no shaykhus, bo b'chinas shaykhus or b'chinas makif ala elmas. So a state of the field of energy that was completely removed has now entered another state or stage that it comes now into some relationship and makif. Like he said before, I'll call upon him makif. Makif meaning it's removed, but it's relating as it's removed. Now here the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe is quoting the Rebbe Rashab. All this, by the way, is word for word from Ayin Beis, page 1148. And he says, "V'zei efshar leimar." You cannot say, because here you can make the argument, 1 second, maybe Ein Sof is completely removed. The divine energy is removed. It's all about the etzem. It's a gilui ha'etzem. That's it. So where does it get the connection to the structure, beginning to relate to a structure? You could say it's coming from the Eir Pnimi. So he immediately negates that. He says, you cannot say that the beginnings of the Ratzon, the desire, which means the beginning of a relationship, and the specific allocation or estimation or envisioning is mitzad the Pnimi, shari ein b'chinas shaychus ala Pnimi. It's a contradiction of terms. There's no relationship to that's the whole point. It's Ein Sof that's removed from the Pnimi. So how could you say the Pnimi is affecting it? After the Tzimtzum separated between Eir HaBligvul and Eir HaGvul, or you could say from the Makif to the Pnimi. So then a Kav emerged. Kav is Pnimi. A Kav emerged, and now the Kav, you could say, affects the Makif. Because, as we said, the Kav paints the whole existence, including the circles, all emerge from the Makif, from the Kav. So Pnimi is causing the Makif to have levels. But before the Tzimtzum, there's no Kav. There's no Pnimi. All you have is a divine field of energy that is shapeless and seamless. So where did it get this association with a Ratzon Le'elamis and Shir Atzmei B'Keach? You have to say it's coming from within the Etzem itself. The Etzem Ha'Eir, obviously by instruction of the Creator, is now instructing the Eir from within the Eir to begin to relate. Now, I explained, you could say the reason for that is because in the Kavana Elyena, in Atzmus, he wants a Dira B'Tachtenim, so there is the Kavana of Pnimi. But you can't say there's an active Pnimi. After the Tzimtzum, you could say there's an active Pnimi called the Kav that actually is the one that creates the circles. The Kav creates the Makif. Before the Tzimtzum, you say the opposite. It's the Makif that creates the Pnimi, essentially you can say. Because it's the Makif, the Eir, Atzmus Ha'Eir, that then goes into another stage where it's starting to relate to Pnimi, even though there's no Pnimi yet, but it's coming from within itself. We learned something like this earlier in volume 2 in Ayin Beis, much earlier. If you remember, he said there's 2 levels in Tzimtzum. There's a Tzimtzum within yourself that you determine, I want to now manifest. And then there's, he said, Tzimtzum derech ha'elamis, that the Tzimtzum is coming through another entity. So I'll give you an example just to make this a little clearer. This was back in the Teres HaMagid, where he said that Tzimtzum atzmei, derech kol ha'elamis. So he explained what's the difference between Tzimtzum and Elmas. So here's a good example. When a teacher determines, and this is another example that works here as well. A teacher, a brilliant teacher, learning Torah all day and all night, is all by himself, and he's able to go in the deepest places because he's a brilliant teacher. He's a brilliant scholar, and he learns and learns. This is all within his own etzem, right? There's no one else there. As a matter of fact, we know that any other person would be a disturbance. We learned earlier that moichin, by definition, relates to another. Because if another comes into the room and starts talking to you, it will what's the word? It'll disturb your focus. It'll take away your focus. So a person is completely immersed in learning, completely. Doesn't hear anything else, doesn't see anything else, complete immersion. Now, he is going to become a teacher. How does he get from the place where he's completely immersed in his learning to become a teacher? You have to say, Ola B'Sene, that in his Atzmizdika state, he now has a desire that he's going to teach. As soon as that desire emerges, he's already now moved away from just being all alone. Even though he doesn't have students yet, and he hasn't even begun a class, and he doesn't even know what he's going to teach. He hasn't prepared yet. But he's made the determination that now he has to move to the area of teaching. Why did he make it? You could say because that's his job. That's because the Eibishter wants. Or the etzem of a person is to be mashpia. He has a taiva to be mashpia, whatever the reason is. It's not relevant to the discussion. We're talking about the stage. Then the next stage is, okay, now that I want that, I have to start determining what am I going to teach? And he starts allocating, has the Ratzon, shiratz mebekayach, what am I going to teach? And how am I going to teach it? There's going to be a shir in this sefer, in this sefer. What type of students? Are they beginner? Are they advanced? So you see, all within himself, in his atzmius, in his, what I'm calling the Erein Sof, are all these things happening. Now, here's the key thing I wanted to distinguish before. I remember I said Tzimtzum and Derech Elamis. The first thing that he needs is within himself. You can't say, in this case, that the reason he decided to become a teacher is, you know why? Someone called him or someone came to him, a student, and said to him, I need you to teach me. That's a different scenario. That's possible, but that's not the scenario. Here it's calling coming from within himself. So you can't say that the Pnimi is causing the Atzmi or the Oyer Atzmi to descend. And within himself, he's doing so. Then when he's teaching and he begins teaching, then there's a bunch of, then the students begin to interact with him. Then he needs to give an example or he needs to direct and focus his teachings. That's already like the Kav after the Tzimtzum, where he's relating with existence. And that's a whole different stage. Then it's an interaction. Then any of the levels are coming from the interaction. Here, it's all coming from within himself. So the bottom line is there's a state, what he's calling here, in Erein Sof itself, on its own terms, it's moving toward having a relationship with another. And it's not due to the other, it's due to the self. Now this may, if you remember well, and this made me reminiscent of another idea that if you remember with Kamayim Aponim Leponim, we spoke about Halos Man, that we know that God wants, that we should evoke through our initiatives, we should generate the divine. It shouldn't come Umayla Lamata. It shouldn't come from above. It should come from us. But then the question is, and every Rosh Hashanah, that's what happens. Every Rosh Hashanah, we, through blowing shofar and through our Avodah, Bameh, Bashefar, that what? Kadeshatam Lichuni Aleichem, we crown God as king. We ask God, be our king, be our leader, be our sovereign master, king, Melech. So the question is, what about the first Rosh Hashanah? What about the first time? Now, the first Rosh Hashanah is not a good example because that would be Adam and Chava. What about before Adam and Chava? When God created the world, where was the Halos Man? So you may remember there was the expression Halos Man Mineu Bei. That the B'min Nimlach B'nishmeshen Shel Sadikim. Who did God consult? The Neshamas. So he asked, what kind of Neshamas? There's no Neshamas yet. So he said, God is envisioning the Nishmeshen Shel Sadikim. He's envisioning, so the Halos Man, he's envisioning what will it be like when there is another stimulating and generating energy from below. So it's all within the etzem. It's a pretty complicated discussion. I can point out to you exactly where it is. We talked about it at length back then. But it reminds me very much to what he's saying right now, because he's saying that it's in the Eir, mitzad the Eir, not mitzad the Pnimi. In other words, that Atzmus, there's an element of Atzmus that is identifying now, wants to identify with existence. Now, this is not a small little matter. You can say, why is it so important to make this focus? And who cares if it's not this way? Because as I said, mitzad the interface, you want to have that the Eir HaGvul is really just another extension of Eir HaBligvul. And this is when it's possible. If God would have made that Atzmus, I'm talking about actual Atzmus now, that instead of having Eir Ein Sof Etzema Eir emerge, he would have two tracks, Eir HaBligvul and Eir HaGvul, you would never have the complete integration of the Bligvul of Elikus and the Gvul. They would be two different tracks. He wants to have the Gvul emerge from the Bligvul. Now, what I mean by Gvul, the power that, like we learned earlier in Ayin Beis, that in the infinite possibilities of the Eir HaBligvul and the Eir Atzmi, he is choosing one. That, therefore, it's still an extension of the Bligvul. It's just now manifesting in one piece of art. But really, it's really a piece of Bligvul. And that makes the connection a much more fascinating, a much more holistic between the Eir HaBligvul and Eir HaGvul. Okay, this is based a little on my Morim of Samach Vav, Samach Zayin, where he talks why you need Eir and why the Eibishter couldn't just make an Eir that relates to existence. Why does he have to start with an Eir that does not relate to existence? Because that allows us, once Eir will relate to existence, once the Ayin that relates to existence, we can relate to that, that will help us relate to an Ayin that doesn't relate to existence. I know it sounds like a paradox, but at the end of the day, existence will be able to relate to a level that does not relate to existence. Similar to what we discussed. How do you have a pre-symptom consciousness in a post-symptom reality? The whole existence is based on symptom. It says because you transformed the symptom. In other words, existence can come to a point where it could relate to beyond existence, because they both originate in obviously in the Eir Ein Sof, which will ultimately, yes, break down to two tracks. But if you remember, the two tracks are equal, shavim in the source. Then they become separate tracks. So right now we're talking about before they become separate tracks, it's Eir Ein Sof that now within that will arise a ratzon that relates to Hashara B'Kayach, like I said, the teacher is beginning to prepare, or the artist was beginning to prepare, or the person who's beginning to build wants a home and he's starting to define the details of that home. To put it in other words, if someone were to ask you, when Mashiach comes and the Geula will be here and everything will be complete, will our individuality and specifics also connect to God, or we will lose our distinctions and we'll all be swallowed up, we'll all be elevated into the oneness of the divine? It's a good question, right? Because you could say, you know what? While we lived in this world, we needed our individual Aveda, each individual, Ein Deis and Shabbos, we're separate people. But then there comes a point where we all become one. All the neshamas join together and they experience God, Hashem Echad. But that's not the kavanah. That would not be dire b'tachteinim loshen rabim. Dire, a home in tachteinim, not just in tachten. That there is diversity. We're not talking about divisiveness, chas v'shalom, or discord or machlekes. Diversity. That's what Hashem wanted. He wanted it in a place that is seemingly so separate from Bli Gvul of Elikus and from unity, that you should experience unity in diversity. So how's that possible? As soon as you reach the light of unity, the diversity should disappear. However, when you realize that Atzmos has a Keyach HaGvul, Bli Gvul, and a Keyach HaGvul, he has a Eir HaBli Gvul, Yechelis, I should say, a Yechelis for Bli Gvul and Yechelis for Gvul. In Atzmos, it's all one. It makes no difference. Gvul and Bli Gvul are both entities that have definition. Atzmus is beyond. Atzmus then manifested in Eir, in the Metzias Nimtza, where now you're starting to begin to have levels, the potential for levels. Bli Gvul, Gvul, then comes a Ratzon Klali, a Ratzon Prati, etc., Tzenis Pratim, everything we're discussing here. So now, what you have is that the Atzmis Diki Yechelis for both is now embedded in the tracks, and it's all originating in one big Eir HaBli Gvul, Eir Atzmi. So then later, when they will ultimately become separate entities, a Kav, igulim, pnimi, makif, structure and beyond structure, but they're all rooted in a place where they really came as one. And they even manifested in Mitzias Nimtza as one, which is Eid Ein Sof, not just Atzmos. So that means in Mitzias Nimtza, in its earliest source, you already have both elements. However, for us to be existent, we have to first begin with a defined structure. You can't say I'm Gvul and Bli Gvul at once. But through Bittul and through Aveda, as we refine ourselves, so our diversity is being refined. Our diversity is rooted in Atzmos's power and capacity to manifest in details. So then when we do our Aveda, we move away from egocentric life and we move toward serving God, serving a higher reality. As we move upward, our diversity will not disappear because it's rooted in Atzmos in the first place. What will disappear is sensing that you're a self-made man, that you are disconnected and you can be hostile and you can see others as competition to you. But if you do your Aveda and the Bittul, at some point you can follow the track of Eir HaGvul. In it is embedded Eir HaBli Gvul because that's how it all started. Remember, the Eir HaGvul was a result of the Eir HaBli. It was just one piece of art that has within it all the infinite possibilities, and also the whole artist is embedded there. However, we need to climb to be able to understand that and relate to it. So the Aveda consists of being able to integrate and appreciate it, but all the elements are there. So in other words, essentially, to put it in scientific terms, within every finite detail, there's infinite potential. There's infinite and beyond infinite. It's just that we have to access it and unleash it and tap into it. Just giving a little more explanation how this is working and what significance and implications of what we're learning is now. Now, you'll say it doesn't say this explicitly, and no, it doesn't. But when you start asking the questions, why does it have to be this way? This is more or less the way to understand and explain it. I hope this was helpful.
Very good.
I'll just add one more thing that makes it maybe a little more geschmack. They say, I don't know, I think it's in Ramach Esi, I'm not sure where it says it, that when the Alter Rebbe ate a meal, the Gashmis, it was Keach HaGvul Shebe Ein Sof. What does that mean? When you and I eat a meal, it's Gvul. A human body needs to eat, so we eat. And there's specific foods, and there's a limit, you can't eat forever. You have a stomach. I mean, everything is about Gvul. What means Keach HaGvul Shebe Ein Sof? Is because he was manifesting not the Gvul Shebezeh, but it's Tzachakal Ein Sof wants to manifest in a meal. It's a very different way of looking at it. In other words, the same Gvul that you and I are looking at, we both can look at the same meal. We can both do the same mitzvah, and one person is experiencing a specific limited mitzvah. Another is experiencing Bli Gvul. It's just packaged in a Gvul package. So really a mitzvah is mitzvah of an Eibishter. The fact that there's a limit, for example, you can only put on tefillin by day. You could only eat, there's a shear for certain things. You could bring a carbon one day, you don't bring it the next day. It has limits. So we see it as a limit, you can't do it. Maybe it's Atzmos simply saying, I want to right now be in this form, like when it says, the expression is, what is the expression? We learned it earlier, but maris, gedelis and maris ktanis. That the Eibishter decided that he wants like a reflection. You can have the reflection of the sun in a drop of water just as much as in the Pacific Ocean. The Eibishter chose to take that simsim atzme ben shnei badei ha'adam. There's an expression that the Eibishter simsim atzme, he limited himself to be present between the two badei, the two rods of the adam. What does that mean? The Eibishter is higher than all these hagbolas. Shlomo HaMelech said to the Eibishter, "Shashamayim v'shmei Hashamayim lo yichal kolucha, afki abayis hazeh." Heavens and heaven of heavens can't contain you, and this little humble house is going to contain you. And the Eibishter said, "Yeah, but Nechus, exactly right. I want to be contained there." How do you explain that? He explained it because Bli Gvul is not limited to Bli Gvul. Atzmos Bli Gvul is not limited to being infinite. He can choose to package his infinity in finite. We see it from the bottom up. We see the finite. And we are looking to see, can we discover the infinite? And we could, but it's going to take work. But from the Mamayla Lamata point of view, Ein Sof is carrying the Koyach Atzmus. Koyach Atzmus has everything in it. Kashem sheyesh lekeche bebilti bagvul. Kach yesh lekeche begvul. In this case, Yechelis for both. It's all equal. And an Eid is carrying that. So basically, the Eid HaBligvul is decided now. And the word decided is not a good word. It's Atzmus is instructing that it should now define itself in a Ratzon Prati. But there's no Pratim here. It's also part of what Atzmus wants. It's also part of an Eid Ein Sof. The Pratim will emerge from the Makabel's point of view. When we are created and we look at a world around us, we begin with Gvul, and we have to start looking and climbing until we get to Bligvul. But the truth is the process was the opposite way. So tzaddikim, like Alter Rebbe, when he did something of Gvul, he was basically doing, it's called Hagbala Atzmis, or Hagbala Ritzenis. In Samach Vav, he says, any limit that is desired is not a limitation. A limit is when it's imposed on you. But if you choose to sit in one place right now, that's not a limit, it's you chose it. So the truth is, it's not a true limit. It's a chosen limit. So right now, you've chosen to define yourself this way. Now, those that connect to that, connect to the idea that a mitzvah is God choosing, yes, that when you're putting on tefillin, or when you're davening, or you're eating kosher, or you're putting on tzitzis, or another mitzvah tzedakah, you are now having, my bligvul is packaged in this gvul, and I want dafka this gvul, I don't want another gvul. This is what you're supposed to do now. You can't say, I'm going to do a different mitzvah now. No, this mitzvah is what's necessary right now, in this time and this space. But it has in it that element of the bligvul. That's a little more acious. Okay. Fine. So he says, the last line we learned, you can't say this, the beginnings of the specific details, hashara b'kayach, the allocation, the visioning, the estimating of resources and the desire, you can't say that's coming from the primi because there's no shaykhus to primi yet. The whole thing is starting literally from scratch, so to speak, from the Eid Ein Sof. So what's he saying, Bekitzer? That Atzmus Eid Ein Sof, like the Makif Be'etzem, is beyond relationship. Then in the Eid Ein Sof emerges relationship, the beginnings of relationship, I should say. The stirrings of a relationship. All within the Eid Lifnei Tzimtzum. So yesterday I mentioned, and that's why we posted on the WhatsApp, I spoke about this at length back when we learned Ayin Beis. There's a letter from the Rebbe because it says, really, Eid Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum in general is all no shaykhus to the world. That's why you need a tzimtzum. But in Eid Ein Sof itself, there are these levels. So they all feel, and Lifnei Tzimtzum, everything feels it's what Atzmus wants. Nothing has its independent entity here. He did not say that the shaykhus ala ilmus means that the Ratzon now has gone off on its own, that's relating to the existence. It's all the way Eid Ein Sof is manifesting in relationship. Not that there's actual relationship, and therefore there's no other to deal with yet, contend with. So he says, Ach be'emes, now in truth, Ayin Beis madreges be'er. This that we just discussed are two levels in Eid. What he means here, the Eid Ein Sof Atzmi, that has no relationship, and the Eid that has, he says, the Eid she'ene b'chines shaychus klal ala elemes, the first level we spoke, the highest level, before there was a Ratzon. The Eid, the energy or the light that has that's in a state, she'ene b'chines, that is not in a state of any relationship at all with existence, with the worlds, hu b'chines Eid ha'atzmi, calling it Eid ha'atzmi. It's not even in a state of amshacha within itself. Now, I know you're going to ask what that means, but this is exactly word for word from Ayin Beis, and I explained it. Does anybody remember? Or you want me to go over it again? I'll explain it briefly, but if you want more arichas, I definitely suggest to go back there because I don't want to give the whole class again. Same thing. I said that. I'll try to put it in some new oases, but or put it the same word, but more summarized. So what he's saying is like this: that means it is oir, but the oir is not doing anything but reflecting its source. That's what he means. Like he says, all you can say about it is that it's extended from Atzmos. Again, word for word from Ayin Beis. The Eid itself, yes, the Eid itself is now a step outside of, not, I want to say outside, a step beyond Atzmos. But in itself, is it doing anything? Is it actively transmitting? Is it being revealed? No. So all you have is that built to Metzias Nimtza has moved to Metzias Nimtza, to put it in blunt terms. That something that was completely a non-existential reality has now moved into an existential reality. And all it is reflecting the source, but it's not in any active motion doing anything else. Not Amshacha and not Gilui. Not any transmission or extension or any Gilui. It's hard to understand this level because it's hard for us to find it within ourselves. Let me go back to the example with the three examples: the house, the art, and the teacher. In each of them, we know there's a point where the entity, the essential entity, is moving now toward an objective, what we're calling a ratzon here ultimately. But do we know where the etzem nefesh moves into the level of etzem ha'oir? We can't identify it because there's nothing to identify. You can only extrapolate that it happened. When we become aware of it, you're already in a state when the teacher, for example, has made the determination that he's going to teach without getting into details. That's already a conscious state. It's impossible to talk about a state that is pre-conscious. Like you said, pre-stimulation, pre-inspiration. Remember, the determination, the ratzon klali or the makiv klali, is already, he said clearly, something inspired. You're already inspired. So it's hard for us to envision a state that we're not aware of yet. But if you think with logic, you have to say that there must be a state where the etzem moved to the oir, and then the oir moved to an inspiration that we're aware of. That's this level in between. It's not etzem, it's not atzmus mamish, it's not already a revealed and conscious state of gilui or hamshacha or ultimately ratzon. So what is it? It's not atzmus and it's not yet gilui hamshacha. So you have to say it's some super-conscious state. I'm just using that word for lack of a better word. Has moved one step from the etzem, but not enough that we can say anything about it that is manifesting in any gilui or hamshach. So the only way we could understand it, and we could all know about it, is either we're told, or if you extrapolate and you say, if the etzem is here, and I see a gilui here, how did the etzem get to a gilui? So the logical step is that before the gilui, there was an that was an atzmi that was not in any manifest form yet. And then it manifests. So then you have a logical progression that from the gilui in Amshache, you can trace it to a state that was not yet revealed or manifest. And then you can trace that to the source itself, the etzem. It's basically the level he's talking about now. Okay.
Yehovis. I'm sure we discussed it a dozen times.
That's going to be the next line. Be patient. Next line.
Okay.
V'hainu, rakshu b'chinas hamshach me'etzem, aber ba'atzmei ein b'chinas hamshach ve'ein b'chinas gili klal. U'b'chinas zu, hu iker ha'er ha'kol ba'atzmusei. This level is the primary level that we say is kol ba'atzmusei. Why is it kol ba'atzmusei? Because it doesn't have any identity of its own. So essentially, Atzmus has manifested in a level that doesn't have an identity of its own, but it's not Atzmus. So it's complete bittul, but in a way that does not manifest in any form or function. So you have now something that's Atzmisdik, but not Atzmus, if you wish. Now we're going to explain now why it's called Iker Eir, that's Kol Batzmusa, because in truth, all the levels of Eir before the Tzimtzum are called Kol Batzmusa in general terms, because they're all about only fulfilling Atzmus desire, but they fulfill it through expression, through a Ratzon Klali, a Ratzon Prati. This level doesn't have anything but a reflection of Atzmus, and it itself is not in any active form of Gili, Hamshach, and so on. Now he's going to say, qualify, and say there's a level even higher than that. Because this is still not Atzmus. He's going to talk now about something which, even though he's not going to use the word Yechelis, but in Samach Vav, he explains this, what we're going to learn now as being Yechelis HaAtzmus. So let me read it and then I'll explain it. And again, all of this we learned in Ayin Beis. There's nothing added here. The Friedrich Rebbe doesn't add any explanation to these words. So if you really want more explanation, go there. I definitely elaborated there more than one class. But I'll briefly state it here because we're learning it again now. So he says, Ve'ein ha'kavona. When we're talking about etzem ha'er, which is the atzmius of er, what's the etzem of er? The etzem of bittel. That is complete reflection of its source and doesn't even have a gili. Not only a gili with shape and form, not only a gili like a determination, altogether nothing. It's like the light inside the sun, if you wish, as an example. So he says, but this level, eina kavona, ala era kol batzmus mamish. Remember the word mamish. So now he's introducing that there's a higher level. There's era that's kol batzmus mamish. It's completely within atzmus. Here we're talking about er atzmi, the atzmi of er. But there's a level of er that's not even er. All it is what he explains in Samach Vav, Yechelis ha'atzmus, to give off er. We're not talking about that here. Shenikra Shmei HaKadman. That's called Shmei HaKadman, the primordial name. Which is most likely the Samach Vav I'm referring to. So you could say, so the reason he's qualifying, you can explain for two reasons. First of all, for the record, the Rebbe Rashab, the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab want to qualify and say what level we're at, but you could say a little more. Because if you think about the interface I was discussing, this would be the final step. Remember, we talked about how you travel from Gvul to Bli Gvul that has a shape and form, Bli Gvul that relates to Gvul, and then to Bli Gvul that's higher than it all, then to Eir, Etzema Eir, that's beyond it all. But what about Atzmus? So the fact that Atzmus has the Yechelis, the capacity to give off Eir, means how Atzmus sees Eir, not how Eir sees Atzmus. And even that is somewhere in the equation, because the Eir, Atzmi, the way Eir is completely bottled to Atzmus, in a way relates to the Atzmus that has the capacity, the Yechelis, to give off Eir. So there's a connection there too. So even though Atzmus is, we know, Leize Iker Elikus, it's not the main thing of Atzmus to give off Eir, just like we learned earlier, but he still has the possibility, the capacity to give off Eir. And as a capacity from Atzmus, it's part of Atzmus. It's an Atzmistic capacity. So there's basically the Atzmius in it, which is Atzmus type of capacity. It's a built-in Mitzias Nimtza capacity to give off Eir, because it's all part of Atzmus. Eir, Atzmi Eir, is a Mitzias Nimtza that's completely bottled to Atzmus. So just wanted to make the distinction. This is, now we're going in the, literally these are the highest levels that Chassidus talks about. Beyond this, you can say almost nothing. Because once you go further than this, you're talking about Atzmus, which we said Atzmus is not even, he's even not even defined by Mitzusim Atzmusei. That's also Loize Kala Atzmus Shabarim Memena Elamis or Nisava Memena Eir. But what we're dealing with here is we're getting to a point where you're coming to a place where you're dealing with Atzmus, how Atzmus sees it all. Will we ever be able to see it through those eyes? With utter bittul, perhaps to some extent, but that doesn't mean we become Atzmus. It means that our bittul allows us, because Atzmus is embedded in every aspect of existence, as I discussed earlier. But the bottom line is that's not the focus here. And Atzmus, the focus here is on Eir, because Eir is what we can relate to. Without Eir, there's no relationship, because it's all than a leap from Metzias built to Metzias Nimtza to Metzias Nimtza. And that is something we cannot bridge on our own. We need Ur to carry us there. Just like Ur is used by Atzmus to create and carry the power of Atzmus, we need Ur to return and to the source.
But even Yechoiles is also a Yerida from Atzmas, right? Even
I never saw
Yechoiles.
that language that's called a Yerida. Yechelis Atzmus, the Tzemach Tzedek, as I explained back when we learned this a few weeks ago, said that he saw an Eksav Yad from the Alter Rebbe, the word Yechelis. I would say Yechelis Atzmus is like Atzmus. It's just a word we use because we have no other word. It's not, I don't think I would call it a Yerida. It's Atzmus capacity, whatever that capacity is. Why do we have to say it's a Yerida? Why is it not on the same level as Atzmus? You say Yerida. If you're saying, does God limited to the word Yechelis? Of course not. If that's what you mean, yeah. He's not limited to the word Yechelis. You know, there are things that you could say are beyond Yechelis. But I've never seen that type of discussion even, because Yechelis means he can do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Capacity
The
to
only
whatever
thing
he
is that Yechoiles is relating already to us.
Not necessarily. No, not at all. Yechelis means the capacity to do anything. Yecholte lahoyer, you could say, loize ikar elikus shenesav menu er. But Yechelis, period, just the idea that he has Yechelis to do anything. So there's Yechelis for er. Correct. That's what he's saying here. It's called er kol batzmusa is Yechelis for er. So of course there's Yechelis also for bria, not only er.
Anthropomorphically, it would be like one person saying, I can give over me, and what I give over reflects me entirely. And one would also say that it also includes the whatever it is of Nisava in that, or that's reflected.
But if you're using that example, I would take it one step further. It also includes that I'm giving over me, even the parts of me that you don't even have any idea of and will never have an idea of. So there's always going to be a tremendous state of mystery and awe. So I'm giving over me, but there are parts that you will never ever relate to because there are parts that you don't even know that exist within Atzmus. You have to add that element because that's what makes God God. Because ultimately he's not giving over the ability to be God. He's giving over the ability to have a connection with Atzmus, but Atzmus has so much more than what he gives that we can relate to is so much how much he doesn't relate to. But as I pointed out, you can have a relationship with something and it remains complete mystery. Since when do you need to own or understand or in some way contain the other? Atzmus is saying, when you say, Eisi atem leikchim, you're taking me here in the Torah, I'm giving all of me in this. That doesn't mean you are going to relate to all of me. It just means you have me. Yes, I'm here with you. But there's all kinds of dimensions, and I wouldn't even call them dimensions, that are completely beyond our capacity to ever even fathom and not even imagine. So you have to add that into the equation.
Yeah, that's a whole picture. You can make the relationship and then automatically you have everything. But probably not so easy to do.
No, I just said you don't have everything because there's a lot of it you cannot relate to.
Can't relate.
So you have everything only because Atzmus says, I am allowing myself to, you're taking a piece of me, so to speak.
Uh-huh. I thought you were saying that even though we cannot relate, consciously, unconsciously, nevertheless, it's all there. And so if one would be able to achieve that, he would have.
I was actually emphasizing the other side, that even though we relate, there's so much there that we'll never be able to relate to.
Okay.
They're both correct in a certain way. Okay. I think we should stop here. Yeah, we're going to continue this discussion. We'll stop here on top of page 57. And great.
Okay.